Before we dive in, if you enjoy raw, unfiltered stories of crime and power, make sure you subscribe. Griselda Blanco's story is a storm you'll want to follow to the very end. The air in Cartagena was heavy that evening, the kind of heat that clung to your skin and made even breathing feel like work. The city had always smelled of salt and sweat, of markets where fish rotted too quickly under the Caribbean sun. Among the narrow streets, barefoot children darted between vendors, laughing, shouting, fighting for scraps. One of them was Griselda, small, dark-haired, with a stubborn mouth that rarely curved into a smile. She carried hunger like a second skin. Her home offered little comfort, her mother's sharp tongue, her stepfather's heavy hand. Nights were filled with anger, and mornings began with the same ache in her stomach. But even as a child, Griselda had a way of looking at the world that made people uneasy. She studied everything: the merchants haggling, the drunks stumbling out of taverns, the thieves who made a living quicker than the honest men. She wasn't just surviving, she was learning. Some kids dreamed of escaping poverty by chance: luck, marriage, miracles. Griselda believed in none of that. To her, the world was simple: you take or you're taken from. At just 11, she proved it. Stories spread, hushed and scandalous, of a boy from a wealthier family who went missing. They said Griselda lured him away with promises of play, then demanded ransom. No one could ever prove it. The boy returned. But whispers followed her after that, whispers that she was dangerous even as a child. It wasn't just rumor. She had already learned how to hold a knife, how to steal without blinking, how to fight when cornered. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. And above all, she didn't forgive. The market nights of Cartagena shaped her into something sharper than the poverty around her. When other kids ran home, she lingered, watching the women who sold their bodies for coins, listening to the men who made their living with threats and blades. It wasn't shameful to her, it was education. Griselda wasn't waiting for a better world. She was building the armor she'd need for the one she had. And slowly, in that coastal city of sweat, hunger, and violence, the Cocaine Godmother began to take shape. Not as a queen yet, but as a girl who had already decided she would never be the victim. The city of Cartagena in the 1950s had two faces. To outsiders, it was a jewel of the Caribbean, a place of music, laughter, and colonial beauty. Bright colors painted the walls, women carried baskets of fruit balanced perfectly on their heads, and tourists saw only charm in the narrow streets. But under that skin of beauty lived a far darker truth, a truth that children like Griselda knew better than anyone. Poverty didn't just live here, it ruled. Families crammed into rooms too small for breathing, mothers worked their fingers raw, and men drowned their failures in aguardiente. Hunger was a language everyone understood. It pressed itself into bones, stretched the skin thin, and made children old before their time. Griselda carried hunger like an inheritance. Her mother, Anna, was a hard woman, sharp-eyed, cold-handed, quick to anger. She had no softness left for her daughter. Some nights, Anna's voice would rise in curses, not only at Griselda, but at life itself, as though shouting at the walls might force them to give back the comfort they had never offered. The men who passed through their home were worse, loud, drunk, heavy with violence. It was in that house that Griselda first learned two lessons she would never forget. The world respected only power, and mercy was a weakness. By the time she reached her teenage years, Griselda had already stopped being a child. The markets became her hunting ground. She stole fruit, bread, coins. At first, she moved with the clumsy hands of desperation, but hunger sharpened her quickly. Soon she was slipping purses from distracted shoppers, cutting pockets with a small blade she carried hidden in her dress. Her eyes scanned everything, the way a merchant's hand moved to scratch his beard, the moment a guard looked away, the sound of footsteps behind her. And she wasn't alone. Cartagena was full of children like her, living by their wits and their thefts. But where others sought quick food, Griselda sought reputation. She fought boys bigger than her, and won, not always with fists, but with knives, with teeth, with sheer unwillingness to lose. Soon, whispers began again, not just about thefts, but about cruelty. One story tells of a girl who insulted her in the marketplace, calling her poor, calling her fatherless. The next day, that girl was found with her face bruised, her hair hacked off in uneven patches. No one could prove it was Griselda, but everyone knew. And then there was the boy, the one she supposedly kidnapped. His name is lost to history, but the story remains. Griselda, not even a teenager, lured him away and held him in a shack outside the city. She demanded ransom, and whether or not she received it, the boy was returned alive. Some dismissed it as rumor, a tale spun larger with each retelling. But others swore it was true, pointing to the sharpness in her eyes, the coldness in her smile. Rumor or not, Cartagena began to see her differently. She wasn't just another hungry girl. She was dangerous. At night, Griselda lay awake on her thin mattress listening to her mother's curses, her stepfather's drunken snoring, the distant sounds of dogs fighting in the alley. Sleep never came easily. Her mind was busy, replaying the day's events, rehearsing new ways to take more, to strike harder, to rise higher. Sometimes she imagined a future where she was no longer the one stealing scraps, no longer hiding from guards, no longer afraid of men who smelled of rum and violence. She imagined herself giving the orders, feared instead of beaten. She imagined rooms full of money, streets that bent to her will, people who whispered her name with respect instead of scorn. These weren't dreams. They were plans. By 14, she had already connected herself with older boys who ran with small-time gangs. They stole, smuggled, fought for territory in the alleys of Cartagena. Griselda didn't just follow them, she studied them. She saw how greed made them sloppy, how fear made them reckless, how loyalty was always an illusion. And when the chance came, she betrayed one of them, trading his stolen goods to another gang for her own cut. The boy was beaten badly for it. Griselda didn't care. She'd proven her point. She was willing to do whatever it took. The city around her kept burning with poverty, crime, and corruption. Politicians filled their pockets while children starved in the streets. The police were as dangerous as the thieves. For a girl like Griselda, there was no path of innocence, only survival, only power. By 15, she was already known as a thief, a fighter, a girl with eyes too sharp for her age. Men noticed her, some with lust, some with fear. She used both to her advantage. A smile when she needed distraction, a knife when she needed silence. And yet, beneath the violence, there was still hunger. Not just the hunger for food, but for more money, more control, more respect. Cartagena was too small for her ambitions. She didn't know it yet, but her path was already stretching far beyond these streets. Her first husband would take her north, across the sea, into the underworld of New York. But before that, Cartagena gave her something more valuable than wealth. It gave her the armor she would wear for the rest of her life. The armor of ruthlessness, the armor of fearlessness, the armor of a girl who had already learned that the world belonged to those who took it with bloodied hands. In the nights when she walked home with stolen coins clutched tight in her palm, the city seemed to whisper to her. Its shadows bent closer, its walls seemed to echo her name. She wasn't just another girl anymore. She was becoming something else. And when her mother cursed her, when men tried to break her, when hunger clawed at her belly, she told herself the same thing over and over. One day they will all answer to me. At this point, Griselda was no longer just a child of Cartagena. She was a weapon the city itself had forged. And soon, that weapon would be unleashed on the world. Cartagena had shaped her, hardened her, but by the time Griselda was nearing 17, the city also began to feel too small. She had stolen from its merchants, fought in its alleys, and carved her reputation in whispers of cruelty. But the hunger inside her, the hunger for more, kept growing. The girl who once scavenged for scraps was now a young woman who wanted something larger. She wasn't content with coins and stolen fruit anymore. She wanted power. She wanted control. And Cartagena, with its endless poverty and small-time gangs, could no longer contain her. It was around this time she crossed paths with Carlos Trujillo, a smuggler older than her, already entangled in the underworld. Carlos wasn't handsome, nor particularly clever, but he had connections. He smuggled documents, jewelry, small loads of contraband moving through Colombia's chaotic ports. For Griselda, he was a door. Carlos saw something in her too, sharp eyes, quick mind, a girl who wasn't afraid of knives or blood. She wasn't like the other women he had known, who clung to him for protection. Griselda looked at him not as a shield, but as an opportunity. Their relationship began as many did in those days, rough, fast, born of survival more than romance. Carlos gave her money, stability, a way out of her mother's suffocating house. Griselda gave him loyalty, at least at first, and a dangerous kind of ambition. Together, they started running small hustles. Fake passports, stolen goods, little schemes that pulled in more money than petty theft ever could. For the first time, Griselda tasted what it felt like to have real cash in her hands, not just coins, but bills, stacks, enough to buy clothes, jewelry, to eat without worry. Yet money alone wasn't what thrilled her. It was the feeling of control, the sense that she was moving up, that she was no longer at the bottom of the ladder. But with Carlos came complications. He was possessive, quick-tempered, and he underestimated her. He saw her as an accomplice, maybe even as property, but never as an equal. And Griselda, even at 18, refused to be owned. Their fights grew louder, more violent. She matched his temper with her own, sometimes with words, sometimes with blows. Once, when he struck her, she returned the gesture with a knife pressed to his throat. "Do it again," she told him in a voice so cold he didn't doubt her. He never struck her again, but the tension between them never left. Still, for a time, their partnership worked. Together, they ran scams across the coastal cities. Griselda learned how to deal with corrupt officials, how to bribe police, how to move stolen goods without leaving a trail. Carlos taught her the mechanics, but she absorbed more than that. She studied the way men spoke in negotiations, the way power shifted in a room, the way fear could be used as currency. And quietly, she began imagining a life beyond him. By 19, she had children, sons with Carlos. Motherhood might have softened another woman, but for Griselda, it only sharpened her determination. She loved her boys fiercely, but she didn't see motherhood as a cage. If anything, it became another reason to rise higher. The world was cruel, and she had no intention of letting her children grow up as hungry and powerless as she once had. Cartagena, however, was running out of opportunities. Smuggling and scams could only bring so much, and the bigger money, the real fortunes, were being made elsewhere. Rumors drifted down the coast of New York, of Miami, cities where Colombians were carving their own niches, where contraband wasn't just jewelry or passports, but drugs, cocaine. At the time, cocaine hadn't yet exploded into the empire it would become. It was still a shadow industry, moving in quiet channels, but the profits whispered of were staggering, more than smuggling goods, more than anything she had ever touched. Carlos heard those whispers too, but where he hesitated, content with his modest scams, Griselda felt the hunger claw deeper. She wanted in. And so, when the opportunity came, a chance to move north, to start fresh in New York, Griselda didn't hesitate. Carlos agreed reluctantly. For him, it was a gamble. For her, it was destiny. The journey itself was unremarkable. Ships, ports, endless waits, the shuffle of paperwork and bribes to smooth their passage. But for Griselda, every moment felt electric. She wasn't just leaving Cartagena. She was leaving behind the life of scraps and whispers, of being a small-time thief in a city too small for her ambition. When the ship finally reached the United States, the air itself felt different. New York was louder, bigger, faster than anything she had ever imagined. Towers of steel and glass loomed where Cartagena's crumbling walls once framed her world. The streets buzzed with energy, filled with faces from every corner of the earth. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, terrifying, and thrilling. But New York was also unforgiving. The immigrant neighborhoods were crowded, poor, and hostile. Jobs were scarce, discrimination common, and survival meant finding your own angles. For Griselda, it was nothing new. Poverty was familiar ground, and danger was a language she spoke fluently. She and Carlos settled into the underworld almost immediately. Fake documents, stolen goods, small-time hustles, The same trades as in Colombia, but in a city with far more money to bleed. But as always, Griselda's eyes were in on the scraps. She was watching, studying, listening. In dim bars and smoky rooms, she heard the whispers again. Cocaine, moving through hidden networks. Colombians, Cubans, Italians, all dabbling in the trade. The money was larger here, the stakes higher, the risks deadlier. But where others saw danger, Griselda saw her future. Carlos, as always, was cautious, too cautious. He worried about drawing attention, about pushing too far, too fast. Griselda argued, fought, demanded. Their clashes grew more violent, more bitter. She wanted more. He wanted safety. And in the end, as always, she won. By the early 1960s, Griselda Blanco was no longer just a poor girl from Cartagena. She was a young woman in New York, married to a smuggler, raising children, and stepping cautiously but determinedly into the world of narcotics. The hunger in her had not faded. If anything, it burned hotter than ever. She had crossed the ocean, left behind her old life, and tasted the edges of power. But she knew deep inside that this was only the beginning. The cocaine trade was still in its infancy. The networks were fragile, the players still finding their footing. And Griselda, cold-eyed, ruthless, fearless, was already imagining how she might not just enter the game, but control it. Cartagena had forged her, New York would test her, and Miami. Miami would one day bow to her name. New York in the early 1960s was not the polished, glittering city you see in postcards. It was grimy, restless, alive with crime. Streets dripped with the noise of traffic, the smell of cheap food carts, and the shadows of men looking for opportunities in every corner. For immigrants, especially poor ones, the city was both a promise and a trap. Griselda stepped into this chaos with the same sharp eyes she once used in Cartagena's markets. Poverty didn't frighten her. Hunger didn't frighten her. What frightened her was the thought of being invisible, of living a life where she bowed her head and accepted scraps. That was never going to happen. With Carlos Trujillo, her first husband, she resumed the small hustles. Fake passports, forged documents, stolen credit cards. New York's immigrant population was desperate for papers, and desperate people paid well. Carlos was satisfied enough with this trade, content to skim money quietly and keep himself out of trouble. But Griselda wasn't built for quiet. Every deal, every smoky room where men exchanged cash, every whispered rumor about the Colombians dabbling in cocaine, it all fed the fire inside her. She wasn't meant to be a petty hustler's wife. She was meant to sit at the head of the table, to command fear and respect. By then, cocaine was still a shadow market. Marijuana and heroin dominated the streets, heroin especially, run through the veins of Harlem and the Bronx by established mafias. Cocaine was cleaner, rarer, more exotic, a drug for the wealthy, the adventurous, the ones who wanted their nights brighter instead of slower. It was expensive, difficult to source, but it was also wide open, and in Griselda's sharp, calculating mind, cocaine was the key. Her first taste of that world came through connections Carlos stumbled into. A Colombian contact moving small amounts of cocaine through New York needed safe passage and distribution. Carlos saw risk. Griselda saw opportunity. She pushed him toward it, argued until her voice turned to steel, until he gave in. It started small. Packages hidden in suitcases passed through airports with bribes and forged papers. Griselda's skill with deception, her cold efficiency, made her invaluable. Where others hesitated, she executed. Where others flinched at danger, she leaned closer. The money was better than anything before. Stacks of cash began to flow in, thicker, heavier, faster. For the first time, Griselda lived not just with food on the table, but with luxuries. New clothes, jewelry, gifts for her children. She decorated herself not in softness, but in trophies of survival. And yet, she was never satisfied. The more money came, the more she wanted. And with it came the first cracks in her marriage. Carlos still thought of himself as the leader, but Griselda no longer listened. She made her own deals, held her own meetings, cut her own paths into the underworld. She had a talent for fear. One story, half fact, half legend, tells of a debtor who tried to cheat her in a deal. He thought she was just a smuggler's wife, a woman to be dismissed. Griselda proved him wrong. They say she had him strangled in his own apartment, the body left in a chair like a warning. Whether true or not, the rumor spread. In New York's underworld, perception mattered as much as fact, and soon the whisper of her name carried a weight. She became known not as Carlos's wife, but as Griselda Blanco, a woman to be respected or feared. Violence suited her as much as business did. She carried herself with the calm of someone who could order death without blinking. Where Carlos sought to avoid confrontation, she embraced it. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reputation, about control, about bending others to her will. Her children grew in this shadow. She adored them in her way, fiercely protective, but they were raised in an environment thick with danger. They saw money flow like water, but they also saw men disappear, heard arguments laced with threats, watched their mother's temper flash like a blade. By the mid-1960s, Griselda's marriage to Carlos was collapsing. He was in her way, too cautious, too weak for the empire she envisioned. Divorce was one option, but Griselda wasn't a woman who left problems unsolved. Legend claims she had him killed, shot, strangled, or disappeared. The stories vary. Official records blur, the truth swallowed by time and fear. But what remained clear was this: Carlos Trujillo was gone, and Griselda Blanco was no longer tethered to a man who slowed her down. She moved forward without hesitation. Her next relationship tied her deeper into the cocaine trade. Alberto Bravo, a trafficker, sharper, more ambitious than Carlos, became both her husband and her partner. With Bravo, she no longer had to drag someone into risk. He shared her vision. He, too, wanted to move cocaine in quantities the world hadn't yet imagined. Together, they expanded operations. Shipments grew larger. Their network spread beyond New York, into Miami, into Colombia. Griselda wasn't just a player anymore. She was building herself into a force. But with expansion came blood. Rivals circled, deals soured, betrayals simmered beneath handshakes. And Griselda, hardened by Cartagena, sharpened in New York, was prepared to answer every challenge with violence. They began calling her La Madrina, the godmother. Not yet in full, not with the fear Miami would one day whisper, but the title was beginning to take root. Even in New York, people knew her as more than a trafficker. She was ruthless, cunning, and merciless. In smoky apartments where deals were struck, men lowered their eyes when she entered. In bars where smugglers whispered about power. Her name was spoken with caution. She wasn't just another Colombian immigrant. She was something else, something dangerous. The early years in New York were not yet her empire, but they were the foundation. This was where she shed the last remnants of the poor girl from Cartagena, where she embraced not just crime, but domination. And as the 1960s bled into the 1970s, she and Bravo began to set their sights on Miami, the city of sun, beaches, and neon, the city that would one day tremble under her rule. But before Miami, before the billions, before the blood-soaked streets, New York taught her the lessons she would carry forever. That cocaine was not just a drug, but a crown. That fear was more powerful than loyalty, and that in the underworld, mercy was a luxury only the weak could afford. By the early 1970s, New York had given Griselda Blanco both wealth and reputation, but it also carried limits. The city was crowded with rival groups, Cubans, Italians, Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, all fighting for slices of the same pie. Her network with Alberto Bravo was strong, but the competition was suffocating. Griselda wanted more than scraps of a crowded city. She wanted her own kingdom. That kingdom revealed itself in Miami. At the time, Miami was still a postcard city. Sun-drenched beaches, pastel-colored hotels, the hum of salsa in the air. But beneath the palm trees and neon lights, the city was changing. The Cuban exile community was swelling after Castro's rise. Colombians were arriving in greater numbers, and hidden among them was opportunity. Miami was younger, freer, less guarded than New York. Corruption thrived and money flowed easily. It was a city waiting to be taken. Griselda and Bravo saw it. Cocaine was still considered an exotic drug, a luxury for the rich. But in Miami, with its wealth, its nightclubs, its tourists, the market was perfect. And unlike heroin or marijuana, cocaine carried an aura of glamour. It was the drug of businessmen, celebrities, models. Clean, white powder that promised energy instead of ruin. Griselda understood what it meant. The demand could be endless. She moved quickly, sharper and bolder than the men around her. With Bravo's connections in Colombia and her own ruthless efficiency, shipments began flowing into Miami. Not small loads anymore, but kilos hidden in suitcases, furniture, appliances. Each brick of cocaine worth thousands, multiplying profits faster than anyone had ever seen. The first sales were quiet. Nightclubs, wealthy clients, whispers passed through the right hands. But soon, the trickle became a flood. The money was staggering. Cash piled so high it couldn't be counted by hand. Apartments filled with it. Closets stuffed with it. Entire houses bought just to store stacks of dollars. Griselda reveled in it. She bought houses, jewelry, cars. She dressed in silks, diamonds, perfume. But her greatest pleasure wasn't the luxury. It was the power. Men twice her size, men who had once dismissed her as just another smuggler's wife, now lowered their eyes when she entered a room. Her orders carried weight, and her threats carried death. But with success came enemies. Miami was filling with other traffickers, Cubans, Colombians, Americans, all eager for a piece of the gold rush. Alliances formed, then broke. Deals soured, betrayals cut deep. Blood began to seep into the streets. Griselda didn't shy from it. Where others hesitated, she unleashed violence. Her killers, some say children she trained, others say men who feared her enough to obey without question, roamed the city on motorcycles, masks on their faces, guns hidden in their jackets. They became infamous for drive-by shootings, pulling up beside cars, spraying bullets, and vanishing into the traffic. Miami had never seen violence like it. The police called it the cocaine cowboy era. And at the center of it was Griselda. She wasn't reckless. Her violence was calculated, purposeful. Every death sent a message. Don't cross her, don't cheat her, don't underestimate her. Rivals fell, competitors disappeared. Debts were collected in blood. But she wasn't invincible. By 1975, tensions with Alberto Bravo, her husband, her partner, had begun to boil. Rumors of betrayal, missing money, secret deals. Griselda suspected Bravo was skimming profits, maybe even plotting against her. And Griselda didn't forgive betrayal. The confrontation came in Bogota, far from Miami's glitter. Accounts differ, but the story runs like this. One night, in a crowded parking lot, Griselda and Bravo met face to face. She accused him. He denied it. Voices rose. Guns were drawn. The fight erupted in a storm of bullets. When the smoke cleared, Bravo was dead. Griselda walked away, wounded but alive. And with his death, she became something more. No longer a partner, no longer a wife bound to another's ambition. She was the sole ruler of her empire. Back in Miami, her legend grew. She was now La Madrina, the godmother. Men whispered that she had killed her own husband, that she trusted no one, that she ruled with iron and blood. Her enemies feared her, her allies respected her, and her name carried weight from Colombia to Florida. The empire expanded. Airplanes flew shipments from Medellín, landing in hidden airstrips across Florida. Couriers carried suitcases lined with powder. Corrupt officials were bought, bribed, silenced. The profits soared into the hundreds of millions. And with it, so did the violence. Miami's murder rates skyrocketed. Bodies littered the streets, victims of drug wars that seemed endless. The city of sunshine was drowning in blood, and at the heart of it all was Griselda Blanco. She raised her children in this world of chaos, training them not in innocence but in survival. They grew up watching their mother order deaths as easily as she ordered dinner. Money surrounded them, but so did fear. Still, for Griselda, it was the life she had always envisioned. Cartagena had taught her hunger. New York had given her a glimpse of cocaine's power. Miami gave her the throne, but power built on blood always carries a cost. And as her empire grew, so did the enemies circling her name. For now, though, she ruled. And Miami, the city of beaches and neon, belonged to the Cocaine Godmother. By the late 1970s, Miami had transformed. It was no longer just a sunny city of beaches and palm trees. It had become the epicenter of the cocaine trade, the beating heart of $1 billion underworld. Airplanes touched down in the Everglades with their bellies full of powder. Boats slid across the turquoise waters carrying bricks wrapped in tape. And behind it all, money flowed in a torrent so vast, the banks themselves choked on it. And in the shadows of this empire sat Griselda Blanco. She had risen higher than anyone could have imagined. The girl who once stole bread in Cartagena was now the godmother of Miami. Her network stretched from Colombia to Florida, flooding the United States with cocaine. Entire neighborhoods in Medellín worked for her, growers, processors, couriers. In Miami, smugglers, dealers, killers. All of them bowed to her authority. The profits were staggering. By some accounts, she was moving over 3,000 pounds of cocaine a month, raking in millions upon millions of dollars. The cash came so fast it couldn't be counted, only weighed. She bought mansions across Miami, decorated in velvet, gold, and marble. Cars lined her driveways, Cadillacs, Porsches, armored sedans. Jewelry sparkled on her wrists and neck, diamonds the size of coins. But the true symbol of her power was not her wealth, it was her fearlessness. Griselda did not hide. She lived boldly, defiantly, as if daring anyone to touch her. She walked into nightclubs draped in jewels, surrounded by bodyguards, her presence commanding silence. Men who killed without hesitation lowered their eyes when she entered. Her enemies plotted, but they also feared. The police knew her name. The DEA knew her name. Journalists whispered about her, but catching her was another matter. She was too careful, too ruthless. Every courier, every dealer, every rival who threatened her could disappear overnight. Witnesses vanished. Competitors were found riddled with bullets. Her assassins, infamous in Miami, rode motorcycles. They became her signature, pulling up alongside cars in traffic, opening fire, then vanishing into the night. The city learned to fear the growl of engines behind them. It was said that Griselda invented the motorcycle hitmen. Whether true or not, the legend fit her perfectly. Fast, ruthless, unavoidable. And yet, power like hers never comes without cost. For all her wealth, all her power, Griselda was not at peace. Paranoia began to stalk her days. Every glance from a stranger could be a threat. Every word whispered in her presence could be betrayal. She trusted few, and even those closest to her felt the weight of her suspicion. She tested her men constantly, sending them on dangerous errands, watching how they performed. A single mistake could mean death. Even her lovers, her friends, her family were not safe from her wrath. She believed betrayal lived in every heart, waiting for a moment of weakness. Her cruelty deepened. One story tells of a maid accused of stealing jewelry. The theft was never proven. Still, Griselda had her killed, her body dumped as a warning. Another tale claims she ordered the murder of a man simply because he looked at her too long in a nightclub. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated, they reveal the reputation she cultivated, a woman who would kill for the slightest slight. Her children grew under this shadow. She spoiled them with wealth, cars, clothes, everything money could buy. But she also raised them in violence. They watched her order deaths. They learned to handle guns. They grew into the trade as naturally as other children grow into school. For Griselda, this was love. She believed she was protecting them by hardening them. The world was cruel. Better they learn cruelty from her than from enemies. But paranoia eats away at even the strongest empires. Rivals circled her constantly. Cuban traffickers, Colombian competitors, even her former allies. Everyone wanted a piece of Miami's cocaine gold rush, and no one wanted to bow forever. Wars erupted, gunfights in the streets, assassinations in broad daylight, blood soaking into the Miami sun. The newspapers called it the Cocaine Cowboy War. Bodies piled high. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire. Miami's murder rate skyrocketed. The city that once promised sun and glamour became a battlefield, and in the center of it all stood Griselda. For her, violence was not a burden, it was a tool. Every death strengthened her reputation, kept rivals at bay. She believed fear was stronger than friendship, more reliable than loyalty. And for a time, she was right. But as her empire swelled, so did the attention. The DEA intensified its hunt. Police cracked down harder. Newspapers painted her as a monster, a demon cloaked in diamonds. Griselda didn't care. She believed she was untouchable. She had killed husbands, rivals, traitors. She had flooded a country with cocaine. She was La Madrina. Who could stand against her? And yet, beneath her diamonds and her empire, the paranoia whispered louder. She began isolating herself, surrounding herself with only the most trusted, though trust for Griselda was never absolute. She grew more erratic, more unpredictable. Some said she began using the very cocaine she trafficked, her temper sharpening into frenzy. Her wealth brought no peace, her power brought no safety. At night, when the city fell quiet, when even the motorcycle engines faded, Griselda lay awake in her mansion. She listened to the silence, to the ticking of clocks, to the distant bark of dogs. She thought of enemies, seen and unseen. She thought of betrayal, imagined and real. And though she had everything she once dreamed of, the girl from Cartagena still lingered inside her, hungry, fearful, watching every shadow. Her empire was at its peak. Her legend was at its brightest. But the higher she rose, the sharper the knives waiting in the dark became. And soon, even La Madrina would discover that empires built on blood eventually drown in it. The heat in Miami was always heavy, thick as a blanket, and it seemed to carry the smell of blood now. In the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, the city was no longer just a place of beaches and tourists. It had become a battlefield, its palm-lined boulevards echoing with gunfire, its neon-lit clubs stained with fear. Cocaine money flowed through every crack in the city, soaking into banks, car dealerships, even the veins of politicians. But with the money came war, and no one embodied that war more fully than Griselda Blanco. She sat at the center of it all, the godmother, her empire stretching like a spider's web across Miami and back to Colombia. She had lived long enough to see herself become untouchable, or at least that was how it seemed. Millions poured in every week. Couriers flew in with suitcases packed with powder. Dealers spread it across the city like white dust over glass. Nightclubs blazed with its energy. Men snorting lines off mirrors, women whispering promises through powdered lips. And in the background, Griselda counted her money, her children playing in halls where bricks of cocaine were stacked like furniture. But the peace of wealth was a lie. Every dollar drew enemies closer. The Cubans who had settled after Castro wanted their share. The Medellin traffickers back home wanted more control. Local dealers, smaller outfits, even crooked cops. Everyone wanted something, and no one wanted to bow to a woman, let alone one who had already killed her own husband and rivals without blinking. The first shots of war were whispers, a courier who went missing, a payment that never arrived, a shipment stolen on the docks. Griselda answered each with fire. Her killers rode through Miami on motorcycles, their engines growling like beasts in the night. They pulled alongside cars in traffic, lifted their guns, and left nothing but shattered glass and blood. Sometimes they hit the right men. Sometimes they didn't. Bystanders began to fall, women walking home from work, children caught in crossfire. Miami was bleeding, and its people learned to fear every sound of a motor behind them. The newspapers called it a war. They weren't wrong. Griselda sat in her mansion, listening to reports as though they were stories read to her. Another rival shot in a parking lot. Another body found slumped over a steering wheel. Another dealer dragged into the night and never seen again. She nodded, approved, gave new orders. To her, death was not horror. It was business. It was insurance. Fear was stronger than money, and she intended to buy loyalty with terror. But even as her enemies fell, the circle around her tightened. The Cubans grew bolder, their own gangs spreading into Miami's streets. Colombians who once worked under her began defecting, tempted by promises of greater wealth or simply too afraid of her wrath. She trusted no one. Her lovers were temporary. Her friends were tools. Even her children, spoiled and armed, were taught that survival came before everything else. And paranoia began to eat her alive. She saw betrayal in every shadow. She accused men of skimming money even when they hadn't. Some she had executed without proof. Others fled before her suspicion turned fatal. She changed her houses constantly, moving from mansion to mansion, convinced that enemies were watching. Guards patrolled her properties, dogs snarled at the gates, but still she felt unsafe. There was a night, one of many, when she sat in her bedroom, the curtains drawn, a glass of whiskey in her hand. The silence pressed in, broken only by the ticking of a clock. She thought of the men she had killed, Bravo, her second husband, rivals whose names blurred together, even the small-time thieves who had crossed her. She told herself they deserved it. They had betrayed her, or they would have. But still their faces came in the dark, crowding her mind, whispering at the edges of sleep. She drank more, numbed herself, waited for the sun to burn the shadows away. The DEA was watching her too. Agents pieced together the network, tracing the murders, the cash, the endless trail of cocaine. But Griselda was slippery. Witnesses refused to speak, too afraid of ending up dead. Police who tried to investigate were bought off or silenced. She had built her empire not just on cocaine, but on fear. And fear was a shield as much as it was a weapon. Still, the blood kept rising. One afternoon, in a busy shopping mall, her men gunned down rivals in broad daylight. Bullets sprayed across stores, glass shattered, shoppers screamed and dove for cover. Miami had seen shootings before, but never with such brazen disregard for the public. It was chaos, and in that chaos, Griselda's reputation grew even darker. She was no longer just a trafficker. She was the butcher of Miami. The city became a war zone. Car bombs exploded in driveways. Bodies were dumped in alleys. Shootings erupted in clubs, restaurants, even schools. Miami's murder rate soared higher than anywhere in the country, and still the cocaine flowed. Each death only deepened the fear, and each brick of cocaine only fed the greed. Griselda sat above it, the queen of carnage, but her paranoia was eating her from within. She began suspecting even her children's friends, certain that spies lurked everywhere. Some she chased away, some vanished altogether. Her sons grew hardened under her gaze, learning to handle guns, to command men, to live without hesitation. But even they felt the sharp edge of her suspicion, the sense that her love was conditional, tied to obedience and loyalty. At night, when the city seemed quiet, her fear grew worse. She kept guns by her bedside, guards outside every door. Sometimes she woke screaming, convinced assassins were inside her room. Sometimes she dreamed of Cartagena, of the little girl stealing fruit in the market, and wondered if she had ever been human at all. But the morning always came, and with it, the business. Shipments continued, money poured in, bodies fell. She began spending with reckless abandon, buying homes in California, estates in Colombia, filling her closets with clothes she rarely wore. Her parties became notorious, filled with drugs, music, and shadows. She surrounded herself with people, but trusted none of them. Her paranoia reached its peak when she began believing the DEA itself was not just after her, but inside her walls. She accused bodyguards of working for the government, ordered their deaths, then replaced them with others she would soon suspect again. She cycled through lovers, always fearing betrayal, always searching for loyalty she would never find. Miami itself began to choke on the blood. Politicians demanded action. Police raided homes, arrested couriers, seized shipments. The DEA intensified its hunt. Every step Griselda took left a trail of bodies, and every body made her more visible. But still, she believed herself untouchable. She told her men that she would never be taken alive, that no cage could hold her. She believed her wealth and her ruthlessness would shield her forever. She had risen from poverty, killed husbands, slaughtered rivals, built an empire out of dust. She was the godmother. And yet, in the silence of her nights, when the guards were stationed outside and the city lay beneath her like a restless beast, she knew the truth. The knives were circling closer. The bullets were already coming. Her empire was built on cocaine and blood always demands repayment. The pressure had been building for years, like water behind a dam that no one believed would ever break. Miami bled daily. and every drop of blood led back to the cocaine pouring into the city. Politicians could no longer pretend it was just crime in the shadows. It was a war spilling into malls, schools, and highways. The public demanded answers, and the government sharpened its claws. The DEA began weaving its net, patient, deliberate, determined. And in the center of their crosshairs sat Griselda Blanco. She could feel it even before the papers printed her name. The raids became more frequent. Couriers disappeared into custody and never returned. Wiretaps hummed on phones. Shadows lingered longer near her mansions. For the first time, Griselda did not feel untouchable. The paranoia that had once been her shield became a gnawing hunger inside her chest. She ordered checks on her men constantly, accused them of talking to agents, sent others to follow them. Some of those men never came back. Others fled the city, too afraid of both the DEA and her wrath. Her empire was too big now, too noisy, too violent. The DEA didn't need to search for her. Her actions left trails of blood straight to her doors. Bodies dumped in alleys, massacres in broad daylight. Cash flooding banks in amounts too large to explain. Everyone knew who she was. The only question was when the hammer would fall. Inside her circle, cracks widened. Loyalty was never her strength. She ruled by fear, and fear can only hold so long before it breaks. Men whispered in private, speaking of her temper, of her suspicions, of the killings she ordered over imagined slights. Some were tired of living under the constant threat of her paranoia. Others smelled survival and betrayal. The DEA offered deals, less prison time, new lives, protection for their families. And slowly, carefully, men who once killed in her name began to turn. Griselda sensed it. Her instincts had kept her alive since Cartagena. She felt the lies, the hesitation in her soldiers' voices, the sidelong glances when her orders grew darker. She lashed out harder, trying to crush dissent before it grew. One man, a lieutenant she had trusted for years, vanished after she accused him of leaking to the DEA. His body turned up days later, riddled with bullets, dumped near the docks. The message was clear. Betrayal would be paid in blood. But the fear no longer worked the way it once had. It only drove more of her circle toward the arms of her enemies. The DEA began to build their case. They had the murders, the cash, the smuggling routes. They had seized shipments, raided stash houses, arrested couriers who now talked freely. Each piece of evidence added to the weight pressing against her. The agents called her the Black Widow, the Godmother, the Cocaine Queen. She was no longer just a trafficker. She was a target, a symbol of everything rotten in Miami's cocaine boom. Bringing her down became more than a job. It became a mission. Still, Griselda tried to move forward, clinging to her empire with bloodied hands. She ordered new routes, new couriers, tried to patch the holes in her network with fresh soldiers, but every move seemed anticipated. Shipments vanished into government warehouses. Couriers walked into traps. The DEA was inside her web, and she could not find the spider. Her paranoia deepened into madness. She began isolating herself, hiding in safe houses, moving constantly. She no longer trusted her guards. She no longer trusted her lovers. Even her sons, grown and dangerous in their own right, felt the weight of her suspicion. She tested them, watching their every move, their every word, waiting for signs of betrayal. She spoiled them with money, cars, women, but beneath it all, she taught them the same lesson she had learned as a child. Trust no one. Kill before you are killed. The streets of Miami reflected her fear. Violence erupted at random. Her killers unleashed not just against enemies, but against anyone she suspected might speak against her. Restaurants, shops, even family homes turned into killing grounds. Each murder only tightened the noose. The public screamed louder. The DEA worked harder. Politicians demanded her head, and still, she refused to flee. Colombia was still hers. Medellin whispered her name with respect and fear. She could have hidden there, melted into the chaos of her homeland, rebuilt her empire in shadows. But Griselda was proud, too proud to abandon the throne she had carved from Miami's blood. She believed she could outlast the storm, that she could kill enough enemies, bribe enough officials, terrify enough witnesses to survive. But empires built on paranoia crumble from within. The betrayal that finally cut her deepest came not from a rival cartel, but from within her own circle. A trusted associate, tired of watching bodies fall and terrified of her suspicions, struck a deal with the DEA. He gave them names, routes, houses, codes. He opened the door that fear had once kept locked, and with his betrayal, the DEA had everything they needed. They moved carefully, waiting for the right moment. They wanted her alive, not dead. They wanted her in handcuffs, her empire shattered, her legend dragged into a courtroom. They wanted the godmother caged. Griselda felt the walls closing in. Every phone call seemed dangerous. Every knock at the door sounded like the end. She doubled her guards, tripled her precautions. She tried to tighten her empire, but the cracks were too wide. Money was seized before it reached her. Shipments disappeared into government hands. Her killers grew restless, their loyalty thinning as the pay dried up and the danger grew heavier. She still lived like a queen, surrounded by luxury, but the luxury felt hollow. Diamonds glittered on her wrists, but she no longer trusted the hands that placed them there. Mansions stood tall, but she never slept in one bed long enough to feel at home. Her empire was rotting from the inside, and she could not stop it. At night, she dreamed of Cartagena again, of the hungry girl with sharp eyes and quicker hands. That girl had survived by being fearless, by taking what the world refused to give her. But now, as the DEA's net tightened and her own soldiers whispered behind her back, she began to wonder if even fearlessness had its limits. The godmother had ruled Miami with blood. She had killed husbands, rivals, traitors. She had made the city kneel. But the shadows were shifting, and for the first time in her life, Griselda Blanco began to feel the weight of inevitability. Her empire was breaking. The DEA was coming, and this time, she would not be able to kill her way out. The storm finally broke in 1985. Miami was drowning in cocaine and blood, and the government had made Griselda Blanco their trophy. For years she had escaped them, slipping through their traps, silencing their witnesses, leaving nothing behind but bodies and whispers. But her empire had grown too large, her enemies too many, her betrayals too deep. The DEA had been patient, building their case piece by piece, waiting until the web was tight enough that even the godmother could not slip free. When they came for her, they came quietly, without the roar of gunfire she had always imagined. It was a house in Irvine, California, far from the chaos of Miami, where she thought she could hide in luxury while her empire ran itself. The sun was warm that morning, the neighborhood too calm, too suburban for someone like her. She was older now, her face harder, her body thickened from years of indulgence. But her eyes were the same, sharp, suspicious, always scanning. She had escaped before. She believed she could escape again. The agents moved in swiftly, surrounding the house, weapons drawn, their voices echoing against the quiet walls. For a moment, she thought of pulling the pistol she kept nearby, thought of going out in a blaze of violence, her legend sealed in blood. But the sight of her children in the house stopped her. They would see it. They would hear the bullets. And though she had never shied from killing, though she had ordered hundreds of deaths without hesitation, she did not want her sons to watch her body fall. So, for the first time, Griselda Blanco surrendered. The agents handcuffed her, read her rights, and marched her out the front door. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, mouths open at the sight of a woman in diamonds and silk being dragged into the back of a government car. The DEA had their queen, and Miami exhaled as though the city itself had been holding its breath. The news spread quickly. Headlines screamed of her capture. Television anchors called her the Cocaine Godmother, the Black Widow, the most dangerous woman in the world. She became a spectacle, a symbol of Miami's bloody decade. Her empire had made billions. Her killings had stained the city red, and now she was paraded in handcuffs, her face grim, her chin lifted as if daring anyone to laugh. In court, the spectacle only grew. Prosecutors painted her as a monster, a woman who had flooded America with drugs, who had turned Miami into a killing field, who had ordered the murders of husbands, rivals, even children. Witnesses spoke of her ruthlessness, of her paranoia, of her cruelty. Former associates, once her soldiers, now pointed their fingers in exchange for lighter sentences. The courtroom echoed with stories of motorcycle assassins, of shootouts in malls, of bodies left in alleys. Griselda sat through it all with the same cold stare she'd carried since Cartagena. She did not flinch, she did not weep. She listened, nodded occasionally, sometimes smirked. To her, weakness was death, and she would not give her enemies the pleasure of seeing her break. Her lawyers fought hard, challenging evidence, discrediting witnesses, twisting facts. But the weight of her crimes was too great. The government wanted a conviction, and they would not stop until they had it. Charges of drug trafficking piled against her. Murder charges circled but were harder to prove. Too many witnesses dead, too many bodies gone. Still, the drugs alone were enough. When the sentence came, it was years of prison. Not life, not death, but a cage all the same. For the first time since childhood, Griselda Blanco was stripped of her freedom. Prison was another world. The godmother who once ruled Miami's streets now slept in a cell no larger than a bathroom, her jewelry replaced by plain uniforms, her guards replaced by corrections officers who cared nothing for her legend. She ate food from trays, lined up for counts, walked in yards surrounded by fences and barbed wire. But even here, she carried her aura. Other inmates watched her carefully, some with fear, some with awe. She was not just another prisoner. She was a queen without a throne, and even caged. She found ways to command respect. Money still flowed into her commissary. Favors were traded in her name. Guards whispered about her, cautious, curious. Yet prison gnawed at her. The walls were tight, the days long, the nights endless. She had been a woman of motion, of power, of command. Now she was just another number, another body in a cage. Her paranoia did not vanish. She suspected other inmates of plotting against her, believed the DEA still watched her every move. She grew restless, angry, unpredictable. Her children remained outside, tangled in the world she had built for them. They tried to carry her name, to live up to her shadow, but the empire, without her hand guiding it, began to crumble. Rivals picked apart the pieces, betrayals deepened. Her sons were dragged into violence, some killed, others arrested. The family she had raised in blood was paying the price of her ambition. Inside her cell, Griselda thought of them often. She loved them in her own twisted way, but she had never given them innocence, never given them peace. She had given them wealth and weapons, paranoia and enemies. She had raised them as soldiers, and now they lived or died by those lessons. Years passed. Her body grew heavier, her face older, her power dimmer. She was still the godmother in name, still feared in whispers, but prison had dulled the edge of her legend. Outside, the cocaine trade shifted, new cartels rising, new names taking the spotlight. Medellin gave way to Cali. Miami's wars faded into history. The world moved on, but Griselda sat in her cell, waiting, remembering. Sometimes she thought of Cartagena, of the barefoot girl in the markets, stealing fruit to silence her hunger. Sometimes she thought of New York, of Bravo, of the night he died in a parking lot. Sometimes she thought of Miami, of the blood, the money, the fear that once wrapped the city around her finger. She told herself she had lived without regret, that she had taken what the world owed her. But in the quiet of the night, when the lights dimmed and the prison fell silent, she wondered if power had been worth the cost. The godmother was no longer untouchable. She was caged, aging, her empire scattered, her children marked. For the first time in her life, she could not kill her way out. She could only wait. The clang of the cell door never stopped echoing, even after years inside. For Griselda Blanco, prison was both cage and crucible. The woman who once ruled Miami with diamonds on her wrists and blood on her hands now spent her nights on a thin mattress, her mornings counted off by guards, her power tested not by rivals with guns, but by the grinding sameness of institutional walls. Yet even here, even in the gray corridors of confinement, she refused to be broken. At first, her presence was a shock to the prison itself. Inmates whispered her name as though she were a ghost stepping into their world. Guards glanced twice, their faces betraying curiosity and unease. This was the woman who had once turned Miami into a battlefield, the godmother of cocaine, the Black Widow who killed husbands and rivals alike. To the system she was inmate number, but to those who lived and worked within those fences, she was still a legend. Legends carried weight, and Griselda knew how to use it. She had always ruled through fear and calculation, and prison was no different. Commissary money flowed easily to her, smuggled from what pieces of her empire still survived outside. Other inmates sought her favor, trading information, cigarettes, protection. She extended her reach slowly, building a network even in confinement. Guards were bribed, favors exchanged, small luxuries slipped past the iron gates. She could not bring back the velvet and gold of her Miami mansions, but she could carve comfort where others had none. Her reputation did the rest. Few dared to challenge her. Rumors of what she had done outside, the murders, the betrayals, the motorcycle assassins, traveled faster than any guard's step. In a place where violence was currency, her past made her rich. She could look at a woman the wrong way, and silence would fall across a room. She could smile faintly, and others would hurry to serve. Even in uniform, even behind bars, she carried the aura of command. But the cage still gnawed at her. Griselda was not built for limits. She was a creature of hunger and ambition, and prison's routines suffocated her. The food was bland, the air heavy, the days endless. Her body grew slower, heavier, her joints aching in ways that cocaine money could never ease. She paced her cell like a panther, her thoughts restless, her temper sharp. When other inmates annoyed her, she lashed out with words sharp enough to wound. Sometimes fists flew, sometimes knives appeared. She did not shrink from it. Violence was still her language. Her children became her lifeline. Letters, visits, whispered updates through lawyers and associates. She demanded to know everything, where they were, what they were doing, who they trusted, who they feared. She tried to run their lives from inside the walls, but distance made her grip weaker. Her sons were grown now, each marked by the empire she had built. They carried her name like a curse and a crown. Some followed in her footsteps, diving deeper into the cocaine trade, carrying her lessons into a new generation. Others stumbled, caught in their own addictions, their own betrayals. Some were killed, bullets cutting them down before they could rise. Each death reached her like a knife pressed against her chest, though she rarely showed it. In visits, she remained stone-faced, her eyes hard, her voice commanding. But at night, alone in her cell, she sometimes closed her eyes and saw their faces as children, playing in hallways filled with cocaine and guns, laughing with the innocence she had stolen from them. She told herself it was necessary. The world had no mercy, and she had given them strength instead of softness. But still, the ghosts grew. Outside, her empire crumbled. Rivals picked at what was left. Money evaporated into the hands of lawyers, officials, opportunists. The Medellin cartel, once her foundation, shifted and fractured. New cartels rose, new names filled headlines. Miami moved on. The cocaine boom evolved, less violent, more hidden. Griselda's name, once spoken with fear across the city, began to fade into history, remembered only in whispers and crime reports yellowing in file cabinets. Inside, though, she clung to her identity. She was still La Madrina, still the godmother, still the woman who had once bent a city to her will. She told her story to those who would listen, embellishing, sharpening, keeping the legend alive. Younger inmates gathered around her like children at a fire, their eyes wide as she described the wars of Miami, the rivers of cash, the taste of power that few could imagine. She fed them not just stories, but warnings. Trust no one. Kill before you are killed. Mercy is weakness. They nodded, hungry for her words, but some left her presence shaken, as though they had touched fire too closely. Her paranoia never left her. Even behind bars, she suspected betrayal. She accused fellow inmates of talking to guards, of plotting against her. Some she threatened, others she silenced with sudden bursts of violence. Guards learned to tread carefully around her, neither too familiar nor too distant. She believed everyone had a price, and she tried to find it in each of them. Years blurred together. The weight of time pressed harder. Her health faltered, heart problems, high blood pressure, the slow decay of a body once fueled by adrenaline and cocaine. Yet, she endured. She had survived Cartagena's hunger, New York's betrayals, Miami's wars. Prison would not break her. She told herself this every morning as she dressed in gray, as she ate food that tasted of nothing, as she counted the cracks in the walls of her cell. She never admitted regret. When asked, by lawyers, by reporters, by curious fellow inmates, she said she had lived her life the only way possible. She had taken what the world denied her. She had ruled, feared, and respected. She had been betrayed, but never broken. Yet, in the dark hours of night, when the prison was silent and her body ached from the day, she sometimes wondered. Not about her choices, she would never confess weakness that way, but about whether any empire, no matter how bloody, could ever truly last. Her release loomed slowly. Sentences ended, appeals chipped away, years ticked off like stones falling into a well. She began to think of the outside again, of Colombia, of Miami, of whether the world still had a place for her. Some inmates dreamed of freedom with hope. Griselda dreamed of it with calculation. She wondered if her enemies still waited, if her name still carried enough fear to shield her, if her children would stand by her or turn away. For now, though, she remained caged. A queen in exile, a predator behind bars, her crown invisible but heavy. She walked the yards with her head high, her eyes cold, her voice low but commanding. She refused to be reduced, refused to be forgotten. Even in prison, Griselda Blanco remained who she had always been, a woman forged in hunger, hardened by betrayal, sharpened by violence. The bars contained her body, but not her legend. That lived on, whispered in fear, in awe, in memory. And as the years stretched forward, she waited. Waiting was nothing new to her. She had waited in Cartagena's alleys, in New York's smoky rooms, in Miami's bloody streets. She had waited for her moment, and it had always come. She believed it would again. For the godmother, patience was just another weapon. The years inside crawled by slowly, but even cages eventually opened. When the gates finally did, Griselda Blanco stepped into a world that was no longer hers. The cocaine wars that had once made her infamous were gone, faded into history books and police files. Miami had changed, Colombia had changed, even the drug trade had changed. What once exploded in the streets with bullets and bodies now moved quieter, more carefully, hidden behind businessmen, banks, and new cartels that operated like corporations. Violence was still there. Of course, it always was. But it was no longer the wild chaos she had unleashed. She was older now, her body heavy, her hair streaked with gray, her face marked by time and strain. The woman who had once walked into nightclubs dripping with diamonds, who had ordered death with a flick of her hand, now carried herself slower, quieter. But her eyes had not changed. They still held that sharpness, that suspicion, that hunger that had carried her from Cartagena's streets to Miami's throne. Her release was not freedom, not truly. She was deported back to Colombia, shipped away like contraband, delivered to a country that both remembered and resented her. Medellín had been her old stronghold, the city where her shipments once began, where her killers once trained. But Medellín in the 2000s was not the Medellín she had left behind. The great cartels had fallen, Pablo Escobar dead, the Medellín cartel shattered, the Cali cartel dismantled. New groups had risen, splintered factions, paramilitaries, guerrillas, all fighting for pieces of the trade. The cocaine still flowed, but the empire she had once ruled no longer existed. For the first time, Griselda was irrelevant. She arrived in Colombia with no throne, no soldiers, no empire waiting. Her name still carried weight, whispered in the barrios, remembered in old stories told by those who had survived Miami's bloody years. But fear fades when it is not fed, and many saw her as just another relic, a ghost of a war long ended. Some younger traffickers even mocked her, saying the godmother had been replaced by men who thought bigger, who killed less publicly, who built their wealth in shadows instead of blood. Griselda lived quietly at first, or as quietly as she could. She no longer had mansions filled with velvet and gold. She no longer had armies of killers on motorcycles. She lived in relative obscurity, surrounded by family, her movements limited, her days smaller. For a woman who once commanded empires, the reduction was suffocating. She was used to counting millions. Now she counted hours. She was used to ordering deaths. Now she ordered groceries. And yet, she still carried herself with the pride of La Madrina. She still told stories, still reminded those around her of who she had been. She spoke of Miami as if it had been hers alone, of the bodies, the money, the fear that once surrounded her. Younger relatives listened with fascination, eyes wide at the tales of motorcycles roaring through streets, of cash piled higher than beds, of men kneeling before her in terror. But others rolled their eyes, tired of hearing the past repeated like scripture. To them, she was an old woman clinging to faded glory, her power reduced to words. But words were not enough for Griselda. She wanted more. Even in her old age, the hunger still gnawed at her. She thought about returning to the business, about re-entering the trade that had built her name. She still had contacts, fragments of networks, people who owed her favors. But the truth was cruel. Her time had passed. The new cartels did not want her. They saw her as a liability, a relic of reckless violence that had drawn too much attention. They dealt quietly, laundering money through companies and governments, moving shipments like shadows. Griselda had ruled through blood, and blood was bad for business now. So she was left with memories. Sometimes, at night, she sat on her balcony in Medellín. The city lights spread before her like jewels. She smoked, drank, and thought of the past. She remembered Cartagena's markets, New York's smoky rooms, Miami's neon nights. She remembered Bravo bleeding in the parking lot, her rivals slumped over steering wheels, the roar of motorcycles in the dark. She remembered her sons, laughing in houses filled with cocaine, later dying in streets filled with bullets. She told herself she had lived without fear, without regret, that she had taken everything the world had refused her. But in the silence, when no one listened, doubt crept in. She wondered if power had been worth the children she had buried, the blood that never washed away. Colombia itself had little use for her. The government kept an eye on her but saw no empire to crush, no army to dismantle. She was watched but ignored. Her danger faded. Neighbors whispered, some with fear, some with curiosity, but most went on with their lives. The godmother lived among them, but she was no longer their nightmare. She was an old woman with a violent past, a name in newspapers yellowed with age. Her health worsened. Diabetes, strokes, the weight of time pressed down on her body. She moved slower, relied on others more. Her empire was gone, her sons gone, her wealth mostly drained. She lived off what remained, small compared to the billions she once commanded. For a woman who had once been a storm, she now seemed like only the echo of thunder. But even as the years dimmed her, she carried herself with pride. When she walked the streets, she walked with her head high. When people stared, she stared back until they looked away. She had been feared once, and in her heart she believed she still should be. She believed her name alone was enough to keep shadows at bay. She was wrong. Medellin had long memories, but it also had long grudges. Enemies do not disappear. They wait. Families who had lost sons and brothers to her violence had not forgotten. Rivals who had once feared her saw her weakness now. Younger killers who had only heard her stories saw in her an opportunity to prove themselves. Griselda had lived her life taking without mercy, and debts like that do not go unpaid forever. For now, though, she lingered in Medellin, living quietly, her days filled with the ghosts of a past she could not escape, and a future that grew shorter with every sunrise. The godmother had returned to the land that had forged her, but she was no longer queen, no longer untouchable. She was an old woman with enemies waiting in the dark, her empire gone, her power reduced to memory. And in the silence of her nights she must have known, the end was coming. The years after her deportation blurred together in a haze of heat, illness, and memory. Medellin was alive outside her windows, loud with traffic, children playing in the streets, vendors calling out from corners. But for Griselda, the world had shrunk. The godmother, who once commanded armies of killers and counted millions in cash, now lived within a much smaller circle. Her home, her family, a handful of caretakers. Her empire was gone, her sons buried or scattered, her health unraveling slowly. She was a queen without a kingdom, a storm reduced to a shadow. Her body betrayed her first. Diabetes gnawed at her strength. Her blood pressure spiked and faltered. Old wounds and old stress left her frail. She walked slower, leaned on furniture for balance, sat longer in her chair by the window. Her hair had thinned, her face sagged, her skin grew pale. She was no longer the woman who once walked into Miami's nightclubs dripping with gold, daring men to cross her. She was an old woman now, fragile in body if not in spirit. But her eyes remained sharp. Even as her body weakened, her gaze carried the same suspicion, the same calculation, the same defiance that had carried her from the streets of Cartagena to the top of Miami's cocaine empire. She still watched people carefully, their gestures, their silences, the way they lingered too long near her house. She still believed betrayal could come from anywhere. And in Medellin, with its long history of grudges and blood, she was not wrong. Her life became routine. Mornings began slowly, with caretakers bringing her medicine, food she often pushed away. She sat by the window, watching the city breathe. Sometimes she spoke to relatives, giving instructions, telling stories, reminding them of who she had been. Sometimes she fell silent for hours, her mind wandering into the past. Afternoons brought visits from a priest, from old acquaintances, from family who still clung to her. Evenings ended with her on the balcony, smoking, drinking, staring at the mountains that framed the city. She lived like a ghost. People whispered of her in the barrios, pointing when she passed on the street, some with awe, others with hatred. Children were told stories of the godmother, of the woman who once filled Miami with corpses and cocaine. Younger traffickers laughed at her, dismissing her as a relic, but older ones remembered the fear, the blood, the weight of her name. She carried both respect and resentment like twin shadows. Inside her own house, the past never left. She spoke often of Miami, of the money, of the motorcycles, of the killings. She retold the stories as if keeping them alive kept her alive. She described the malls sprayed with bullets, the couriers who vanished, the rivals who begged before they died. Her family listened, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with weariness. They had heard it all before, but for Griselda, the past was all she had left. At night, when the city quieted, the ghosts came. She dreamed of Cartagena, of a hungry girl stealing fruit. She dreamed of Alberto Bravo, bleeding in that parking lot in Bogota. She dreamed of Miami, of gunfire echoing in the streets, of bodies slumped in cars, of her sons laughing in houses filled with cocaine. She woke sweating, her heart racing, convinced for a moment that she was back in the middle of it all. Then she remembered the truth. She was old, sick, caged now not by bars but by her own body. Her paranoia never faded. She suspected her caretakers of stealing. She accused neighbors of watching her. She believed enemies still hunted her, even decades after her empire collapsed. And perhaps they did. Medellin was a city of long memories, and Griselda had made more enemies than most. Families who had lost sons, brothers, fathers to her violence had not forgotten. Rivals who had once feared her now saw her weakness. Younger killers, eager to prove themselves, whispered of the godmother as a target. She knew this, and she lived with it, waiting for the day the shadows would finally step into her light. The city itself was different. The Medellin she had known was violent, bloody, ruled by cartels like hers. The Medellin she returned to was quieter, more modern, its violence hidden deeper, its streets calmer. The new generation moved cocaine differently, through corporations, through banks, through silent deals. They killed, yes, but not with the reckless chaos that had marked her reign. They saw her as a dinosaur, a relic of an age when blood flowed too openly. She hated them for it, these men who thought themselves smarter because they killed in silence instead of fire. She believed fear was still the strongest weapon, and she believed she had proven it. Yet fear did not protect her anymore. She had no army, no killers, no empire to shield her. All she had was her name, her legend, and the fading respect it carried. Her family tried to care for her, but even they were fractured. Some remained loyal, watching over her, shielding her from the worst of her enemies. Others drifted away, tired of the weight of her name, tired of living in her shadow. Her sons, the ones who had survived, carried scars too deep to heal. Some were imprisoned, others hiding, all marked by the empire she had built. Griselda had always told herself she raised them strong, but in truth, she had raised them cursed. Her health worsened steadily. Diabetes ate at her, strokes weakened her, doctors warned her constantly. She took her medicine reluctantly, resented the weakness of her body, cursed the way age had reduced her. She had lived her life defying death, yet now death approached slowly, patiently, without the roar of bullets. It was a different kind of enemy, one she could not kill. Still, she carried herself with pride. She walked into church with her head high, even when she needed help to stand. She stared down those who whispered in the pews, daring them to meet her eyes. She still dressed with care, still wore jewelry, still clung to the fragments of her throne. She refused to let the world see her broken. But inside, she knew. She knew the end was closer each day. She felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the way her breath shortened at night. She knew her enemies still waited, and she knew her body would not fight forever. She told herself she had no regrets, but in the quiet, she thought of her sons, of the lives she had destroyed, of the blood she had spilled. She told herself it was necessary, but sometimes she wondered if she had lived her life only to leave behind ghosts. Medellin went on around her, loud and alive, while she lived like a shadow, waiting. Waiting had always been her skill. She had waited in Cartagena, in New York, in Miami. She had waited for enemies, for betrayals, for opportunities. Now she waited for the end, knowing it would come, not knowing when. The godmother had once ruled with diamonds and blood. Now she sat in a chair by her window, watching the city breathe, smoking, drinking, remembering. She was no longer queen, no longer untouchable, no longer feared the way she once was. But she was still Griselda Blanco, and she would face the end the same way she had faced everything else. Head high, eyes sharp, unbroken. And somewhere in the streets below, the men who remembered her violence, or the young killers who wanted her name as their trophy, sharpened their knives and waited too. The streets of Medellin carried a rhythm all their own. Vendors called out from corners, motorcycles growled through traffic, children ran barefoot between cracked sidewalks. To most people, it was just another city, alive and restless. But for Griselda Blanco, each sound carried a weight. Each motorcycle's roar pulled her eyes to the window. Each knock at the door tightened her chest. She had lived long enough to know that death did not announce itself. It came sudden, sharp, without warning. Her health was failing, but her instincts remained. She still woke in the night. Certain shadows lingered outside her walls. She still tested the loyalty of those closest to her, suspicious of caretakers, suspicious even of relatives who brought her food or medicine. She lived with fear, but not the kind that paralyzed. For Griselda, fear had always been a weapon. It kept her alert. It kept her alive. And yet, even she knew that her shield was thinner now. The Medellin of her old empire was gone. The cartels that once bowed to her had been dismantled or replaced. New traffickers ran their businesses like corporations, men who wore suits instead of gold chains, who spoke softly instead of spraying bullets across crowded streets. They saw her as a relic, a name from the bloody past. But in the barrios, among those who remembered the war years, her name still carried an echo, the godmother, La Madrina. Some whispered it with fear, others with hatred, and hatred has a longer memory than fear. Her days were quiet now. She rose late, her body heavy, her breath short. Caretakers prepared her food, adjusted her medication, fussed over her health. She sat in her chair by the window, staring at the city she once ruled in whispers and blood. She smoked, drank, told stories when visitors came, stories of Miami's chaos, of the rivers of money, of the corpses left as warnings. Her voice grew sharp when she spoke of betrayal, of the men who had turned on her, of the enemies she had outlived. But the stories always ended the same way, with her still alive. She wore her survival like a crown, proof that she had beaten them all. But even queens fall. It was a September afternoon in 2012 when the end finally came. Griselda had left her house, something she rarely did anymore. She had grown older, heavier, slower, but she still believed in showing herself and living as though she was untouchable. She was driven to a butcher shop in Medellín, a routine stop. Some say she went for meat, others say it was habit, a pattern she had kept for years. But habits are dangerous. They leave trails. The shop was unremarkable, tucked between other stores, its windows streaked, its counters lined with slabs of beef and pork. She stepped inside with her caretaker, her presence attracting only passing glances. Few recognized her now. The once feared godmother looked like an old woman, dressed plainly, her hair pulled back, her steps slow. But to those who knew her past, to those who still remembered the blood she had spilled, she was not just another old woman. She was unfinished business. Outside, a motorcycle idled. Two men sat on it, helmets on, their eyes sharp beneath the visors. They had been waiting, patient, certain. Griselda Blanco had lived decades longer than many believed she would, but deaths do not vanish. The order had been given, whether by old enemies, by families who had lost sons and brothers, or by men who simply wanted the glory of killing the godmother. The reasons mattered little. What mattered was that the moment had come. She finished her purchase, stepped back into the afternoon light. The air was warm, the street alive with noise. For a brief second, she might have thought she was safe, that the city had spared her again. Then, the motorcycle roared forward. The men did not hesitate. One raised his gun, leveled it at her head, and pulled the trigger. The crack split the street. Griselda collapsed, blood spilling onto the pavement, her body crumpling against the curb. The caretaker screamed. Bystanders froze, then scattered. The motorcycle sped away, its roar fading into the distance, leaving only silence and the smell of gunpowder. It was quick, brutal, without ceremony. The kind of death she had once ordered countless times, delivered now to her. Irony, justice, vengeance. Call it what you will, but it was fitting. The woman who had invented the art of the motorcycle assassination was killed by it. The godmother of Miami, who had once unleashed killers on wheels to strike fear into her enemies, died by the same method. Her body lay on the street, lifeless, blood pooling beneath her head. People gathered, whispering, pointing. Some shook their heads, muttering that it was bound to happen. Others spat, saying justice had come too late. A few crossed themselves, murmuring prayers for her soul. For all her violence, she was still human, still mortal. And in Colombia, even monsters are mourned by someone. News spread quickly. Newspapers reported the assassination with grim satisfaction. The Cocaine Godmother, dead at 69. Television anchors repeated her titles, her crimes, her legacy. Some painted her as a demon, a killer who got what she deserved. Others told her story like a legend, the rise of a poor girl from Cartagena who clawed her way to power, who bent cities to her will, who died as violently as she lived. Her family wept, her enemies celebrated, her city shrugged. In Medellin, death was not rare. Assassinations happened every week, but this one carried weight. This one closed a chapter. For Griselda, there was no last speech, no defiance, no chance to raise her head high. Death came fast, as she had always known it would. She had outlived husbands, rivals, children, empires. She had survived wars, betrayals, prisons. But in the end, a single bullet on a warm afternoon ended what no government, no rival cartel, no prison cell could truly destroy. Her funeral was small, attended by family, watched from afar by those who remembered her reign. There were no grand processions, no crowds of mourners. She had been feared, not loved. She had ruled with blood, not kindness. Her name lived on, but her body was laid into the earth quietly, without ceremony fitting of a queen. Perhaps that was justice too, that the woman who had once commanded so much power left the world without fanfare. And yet, her legend refused to die. Even after her death, stories of Griselda Blanco spread. She became myth, a name spoken in documentaries, in books, in whispers of the old days. Some remembered her as a monster, others as a pioneer, a woman who carved a path in a world of men, no matter how bloody that path was. In the barrios, her name still carried fear. In the history of Miami, she remained a stain that could never be erased. But in the end, all the power, all the money, all the blood could not change the truth. She died as she had lived, violently, suddenly, without mercy. The girl from Cartagena, who once stole fruit from markets, who dreamed of power in alleyways, who ruled Miami with a hand of iron and fear, ended her life on a street in Medellin, killed by the very weapon she had unleashed on others. For Griselda Blanco there was no redemption, no peace, only the silence of death and the memory of her shadow cast long over 2 continents. The news of her death rippled outward from Medellín like the aftershock of an earthquake, first in whispers on the street, then in headlines, then across televisions and radios around the world. Griselda Blanco, the Cocaine Godmother, shot dead at 69. For most, it was not shock. Many had expected it for decades. What startled people was not that she had died, but that she had lived so long. For a woman who built her empire on betrayal, on violence, on blood, reach old age at all seemed almost unnatural. But now the story had an ending, and endings always force people to decide what to remember. Her family took the news hardest, though even their grief was complicated. She had raised her children in her shadow, spoiled them with wealth and power, but also cursed them with her enemies, her paranoia, and the violent world she created. Some of her sons were already dead by the time the bullet ended her life. Others were in hiding, fugitives of the same world she had built. A few came to her funeral quietly, faces down, wary of the eyes watching. There were no large gatherings, no outpourings of love. Her burial was modest, attended only by relatives and a few who had remained loyal through the years. For all the billions she had commanded, for all the men she had killed, she left this world with little more than a grave and a handful of mourners. One of her sons, the last who tried to carry her name in the trade, wept openly at her coffin. His tears were for his mother, but also for himself, for the years spent running from enemies, for the weight of being her child. To be Griselda's son was to inherit not just money, but curses. The DEA had watched them, the cartels had hunted them, and betrayal had followed them as faithfully as blood. He kissed her forehead, cold now, and whispered something only the coffin heard. Outside the family, reactions were colder. Victims' families, those who had lost brothers, fathers, sons to her violence, murmured that justice had finally come. Too late, perhaps, but it had come. They said the streets of Miami and Medellin were quieter without her. Some even celebrated privately, drinking to the end of the woman who had made their lives hell. Law enforcement, especially in the United States, allowed themselves grim satisfaction. Agents who had chased her in the 1980s, who had watched Miami drown in blood, spoke to journalists. They called her cunning, ruthless, paranoid, a predator who had turned murder into business. They said she was brilliant but reckless, fearless but doomed by her own appetite. Some admitted grudgingly that she had been ahead of her time, a woman who carved a path through a world dominated by men, who commanded fear in rooms where few women were ever allowed. But no one romanticized her. They saw her as a monster, and her death, even decades late, felt like a door finally closing. In Miami, the city she once ruled, people remembered. Old-timers recalled the days of the cocaine cowboys, the shootouts in malls, the corpses in cars. They spoke of her with a mix of awe and disgust. To them, she was part of the city's dark history, a stain that could never be fully erased. Younger people, those who had only heard the stories, treated her like a legend, almost mythological. To them, she was a name, a story told in documentaries, a symbol of an era when Miami was wild, dangerous, dripping with both cocaine and blood. But legends are not kind. Her name became shorthand for ruthlessness, for paranoia, for power corrupted. She was remembered less as a mother, less as a woman, and more as an icon of violence. Her children carried the weight of that legacy. Some tried to disappear, to change names, to build quiet lives far from her shadow. Others remained tied to the trade, unable or unwilling to escape the world she had raised them in. But none were free. Her enemies outlived her in many ways, their grudges extending to her bloodline. Being a Blanco meant living with a target painted on your back. Even in death, Griselda cursed her family with the consequences of her choices. In Colombia, opinions split. Some saw her as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in their country. The poverty that birthed her, the corruption that allowed her, the violence that scarred generations. They spoke of her as a cancer, one finally cut away. Others, especially in poor neighborhoods, remembered her differently. They whispered that she had been generous once, that she had given money, food, gifts to those in need. They told stories of her handing out cash, of her helping families when no one else would. For them, she was not just a monster, but a paradox, a woman who destroyed with one hand and gave with the other. But history is not written by whispers. In books, in reports, in films, she became fixed as the Cocaine Godmother, the ruthless queen of Miami's blood-soaked empire. Scholars analyzed her as a rare example of a woman rising in a male-dominated underworld. Journalists painted her as both fascinating and horrifying. Television turned her into entertainment, a character larger than life, her crimes retold in dramatic tones. Her death by motorcycle hit sealed her legend. The irony was too sharp to ignore. Killed by the very method she had unleashed, the very weapon that had made Miami fear her. Journalists highlighted it, law enforcement pointed to it, the public marveled at it. It was a story too clean, too poetic. The Godmother, slain by her own invention. But beneath the legend was still a woman, and those who had known her closest wrestled with that. Her family spoke of her laughter, her sharp wit, her fierce love in private moments. They said she adored her children, that she spoiled them with gifts and defended them with her life. They said she was not only ruthless, but vulnerable, not only cruel, but human. They told stories that complicated the monster painted in headlines. But the world was not interested in complication. The world wanted its villain, and Griselda Blanco fit the role perfectly. As the weeks passed, her death faded from headlines. New crimes filled the news. New scandals replaced her name. But her shadow remained. Documentaries revived her story. Books dug into her past. People could not resist the tale of a poor girl from Cartagena who became the queen of cocaine, who ruled men with fear, who built an empire of blood, who died as violently as she lived. Her grave became a quiet marker, visited by some family, ignored by most. It was not a shrine, not a monument, just another grave in a country filled with them. Yet those who stood before it sometimes felt the weight of her name, the history buried beneath the soil. The aftermath of her death was not peace. Her family still lived with threats. Her enemies still celebrated. Her legacy still haunted Miami and Medellin. But there was finality in it. For decades, she had been the storm, the shadow, the godmother who seemed untouchable. Now she was gone, her body silenced, her story complete. And perhaps that was the truest end for Griselda Blanco. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not even justice, but silence. The silence she had denied so many others. The silence that comes when fear fades, when blood dries, when legends become memory. Death did not end Griselda Blanco. If anything, it breathed new life into her legend. On the streets of Medellin, her blood soaked into the pavement, but across the world, her name began to echo louder than it had in decades. Newspapers replayed her story. Television anchors retold her crimes. Filmmakers circled her like vultures around a carcass. The Cocaine Godmother was no longer just a criminal. She was a character, a myth, a symbol too dramatic to leave buried. In Miami, where her empire had once drowned the city in cocaine and gunfire, old wounds reopened. Retired DEA agents and police officers spoke into cameras, reliving the terror of the 1980s. They remembered the bodies left in cars, the shootouts in shopping malls, the fear that hung in the air like humidity. They spoke her name with disgust, but also with a strange reverence. She had been their enemy, but she had also been unforgettable. She was as ruthless as Escobar, one said, maybe worse. Another admitted grudgingly, she was smarter than most of the men we chased, fearless, cold. She knew how to make people afraid. For the younger generation who had not lived through her reign, Griselda became a story told in headlines and documentaries. Netflix, cable channels, filmmakers, all wanted her tale. She was perfect for the screen, a woman who had risen from poverty to power, who had commanded armies of men, who had died by the very weapon she had invented. It was a story too sharp to dull, too rich to ignore. She became entertainment, her violence repackaged as drama, her paranoia as plot twists, her empire as spectacle. In Colombia, reactions were mixed. Some saw her as a shameful reminder of the country's bloody past, proof of how poverty, corruption, and drugs had devoured a generation. Others whispered of her with fascination, almost pride, pointing out that she had been a woman who outplayed men in a world where women were expected to serve, not rule. Feminists debated her. Was she a symbol of female strength, or a monster whose only weapon was cruelty? Was she proof that women could rise in any field, even the darkest, or proof that power itself corrupts regardless of gender? In poor neighborhoods, her legend took on a different flavor. Old stories resurfaced, how she had handed out money to struggling families, how she had helped those in need when no one else would. These stories, whether true or embellished, softened her in some eyes. To them, she was not only a killer, but also a benefactor, a paradox wrapped in diamonds and blood. They remembered the gifts, the food, the handouts, not the corpses left behind. In places where governments had failed, even criminals could become saints. But history is not made in whispers alone. Books dissected her life. Journalists dug through archives. Scholars analyzed her empire. They traced her path from Cartagena's hungry streets to New York's smuggling rings, to Miami's bloody throne, to her final fall in Medellin. They compared her to Escobar, to the Cali cartel, to the newer, quieter generation of traffickers. Some argued she had paved the way for them, showing how cocaine could flood America. Others dismissed her as reckless, saying her obsession with fear and violence made her empire unsustainable. But no one denied her impact. Pop culture embraced her with open arms. Documentaries turned her into a household name again. Dramatized series cast actresses to play her, turning her into a character equal parts terrifying and magnetic. Young audiences who had never heard her name before watched, fascinated by the story of the godmother who once made Miami tremble. Some admired her, seeing strength in her rise. Others recoiled at her cruelty, horrified by the bodies left in her wake. But everyone remembered her. And for legends, memory is everything. Her image even reached music. Rappers name-dropped her, using her name as shorthand for power, wealth, ruthlessness. In hip-hop, where the drug trade often looms as metaphor and myth, Griselda became a symbol of dominance, her life woven into lyrics like a badge. Her story became inspiration for those who saw in her not a monster, but a figure who took control of her world, no matter how bloody the price. But not everyone glorified her. Critics warned of romanticizing violence, of turning murderers into icons. They argued that documentaries and dramas risked painting her as glamorous, forgetting the innocent lives destroyed by her empire. They pointed to the families shattered, the children caught in crossfire, the addicts whose lives ended with her cocaine. They said her story should be told as warning, not entertainment. Yet the truth is messy, and legends rarely fit neatly into boxes. Griselda was monster and pioneer, mother and murderer, victim of poverty and architect of violence. She was ruthless, paranoid, brilliant, destructive. She was human, and she was larger than life. Her children carried her shadow long after her death. Some tried to vanish, to erase the Blanco name. Others leaned into it, giving interviews, telling their own sides of the story. They spoke of a mother who loved fiercely, who spoiled them, who raised them in wealth. They also admitted the violence, the fear, the constant threat of death. They lived as her legacy, caught between pride and curse. Some met violent ends themselves, proving that her shadow did not fade easily. In Medellin, her grave became a quiet landmark, not a shrine, not a tourist attraction, but a place where whispers gathered. Some came to curse her, others to pay respect, a few perhaps just to see where the godmother lay. There were no statues, no monuments, no gilded markers, just a grave, simple and cold, holding a woman who once commanded billions in armies but ended as all mortals do. But in books, in screens, in songs, her legend grew louder. People outside Colombia, outside Miami who had never known her world, now spoke her name. To some, she was a cautionary tale, proof of what greed and paranoia create. To others, she was an anti-hero, someone who refused to be weak in a world designed to crush her. To many, she was just fascinating, a story too strange, too violent, too human to look away from. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Griselda Blanco. Not the billions she made, gone now. Not the empire she built, dismantled long ago. Not even the blood she spilled, though it still stains. Her true legacy is the story itself, the story of a girl born into poverty who clawed her way up through theft, through smuggling, through murder, who bent cities to her will, who defied men and governments, who lived paranoid and ruthless, and who died by the very method she had unleashed. It is a story of hunger, of ambition, of fear, of inevitability, a story that refuses to fade. Even in death, Griselda Blanco remains alive, in memory, in legend, in the uneasy fascination of a world that cannot decide whether to condemn her, admire her, or both. She is no longer just a woman. She is myth, cautionary tale, icon, the godmother of cocaine. In the end, all that remains of a life, no matter how vast, no matter how bloody, no matter how loud, is memory. For Griselda Blanco, memory is complicated. To some, she is the monster who drowned Miami in cocaine, who turned neighborhoods into war zones, who ordered deaths as casually as meals. To others, she is the poor girl from Cartagena, who clawed her way to power in a world stacked against her, who refused to be weak, who built an empire when no one believed a woman could. To most, she is both, victim and villain, survivor and executioner, mother and murderer. Her life began in hunger. Cartagena in the 1940s offered her little but poverty and pain. A violent household, an unforgiving street, a child who learned early that softness meant suffering. She stole to eat, fought to survive, and decided before her teens that she would never be powerless again. That hunger, physical at first, then spiritual, followed her across every border, through every betrayal, through every empire she built. It became the rhythm of her existence, the drumbeat that never stopped. Take more, trust less, never bend. Her rise was carved through opportunity and cruelty. In New York, she discovered cocaine not just as a drug, but as a weapon, a crown. With Alberto Bravo, she turned smuggling into fortune, and with his blood, she claimed sole power. In Miami, she unleashed chaos, flooding the city with rivers of powder and corpses. She created an empire built on fear, teaching her rivals that loyalty was temporary but terror eternal. The sound of motorcycles in the night became synonymous with her name. People lowered their voices when they spoke of her, fearing even the echo of her legend. She had money beyond counting, killers at her call, politicians and police on her payroll. She was La Madrina, the godmother, the queen of a kingdom made of cocaine. But power built on fear is always temporary. It eats itself. Her paranoia became both her shield and her downfall. She suspected everyone, lovers, friends, even her children. She killed when she didn't need to. She destroyed alliances that could have protected her. She created enemies faster than she eliminated them, and in Miami, the blood flowed too openly. The DEA could no longer ignore her. She became their target, their trophy, the symbol of everything wrong in the cocaine explosion. Her arrest was not glorious. There were no final shootouts, no cinematic escapes, just handcuffs, silence, and the slow erosion of years behind bars. In prison, she remained feared, respected, but caged. She told stories of her empire, but stories were all she had left. Her children, raised in violence, carried her shadow but also her curse. Some died, others disappeared, all scarred by her choices. Outside, her empire crumbled. The Medellin cartel collapsed. The trade shifted. The world moved on. She sat in her cell while history rewrote itself without her, and yet she endured. She lived long enough to leave prison, long enough to see Colombia again, long enough to realize she was no longer queen but relic. Her health declined, her wealth faded, her enemies grew older but did not forget. She became a ghost in Medellin, sitting on balconies, telling stories, waiting for the end she always knew would come. When it did, it came with cruel poetry. A motorcycle, a gun, a single shot. The very method she had pioneered, the very weapon she had unleashed, turned on her. She collapsed on a Medellin street not as the untouchable godmother, but as an old woman buying meat. No armies at her side, no diamonds on her wrists, no empires left to command. Just blood on the pavement, a body in the street, and a legend sealed in irony. Her death was not the end of her story. If anything, it was its final chapter, the piece that made it whole. Journalists rushed to write it, filmmakers raced to capture it, musicians wove her name into songs. She became larger in death than in life, mythologized as the queen of cocaine, the Black Widow, the ruthless woman who outlived most of her rivals. People who had never heard her name before now spoke it. Some admired her strength. Some despised her cruelty. All were fascinated. But fascination does not erase truth. The truth is that her empire was built on death, that innocent people were gunned down in her wars, that families were destroyed by the cocaine she smuggled, by the violence she unleashed, that her children carried her sins on their backs, that the fear she sowed lived longer than her wealth. She was not just a symbol of power, she was a reminder of what power costs, and yet she cannot be dismissed as just another criminal. She was singular, unique, a figure who carved herself into history by sheer will. In a world where women were expected to play roles in the background, she forced herself into the center. She matched men in brutality, surpassed them in paranoia, and demanded fear in every room she entered. Her story is both warning and testament that hunger can build empires, but it cannot build peace. That fear can command loyalty, but it cannot buy love. That power without mercy always ends in blood. What remains now is silence. Her grave is simple, her empire gone, her family scattered. But her name lingers in the air, in documentaries, in songs, in whispers on streets where motorcycles still roar. She is remembered not for kindness, but for ruthlessness, not for peace, but for chaos, not for love, but for fear. And maybe that is fitting. She built her life on fear. Why should her legacy be any different? The story of Griselda Blanco is the story of survival turned into obsession. A girl who refused to be weak became a woman who refused to trust. A queen who refused to bend became a ghost who could not rest. She proved that even those born in hunger can command the world, but she also proved that every crown carved from blood will one day choke its wearer. History will not forget her, but it will not forgive her either. She will live forever in the uneasy space between fascination and horror, between myth and memory. Not just as the Cocaine Godmother of Miami, not just as a criminal, but as a warning that hunger without limits consumes everything, even the one who carries it. And so, in the end, Griselda Blanco leaves us not with lessons of triumph, but with shadows. The shadow of Cartagena's streets, the shadow of Miami's blood, the shadow of Medellin's bullet. She lived without mercy, and she died without peace. She was La Madrina, the godmother. And her silence now is louder than her reign ever was.